Top of the morning, Dan and Amy in the Cheesehead State. I don't think it's technically, I think it's technically called the Badger State, but I prefer the Cheesehead State. Giving hope to the land of Lincoln, at least the state Supreme Court is, by shutting down Governor Tony Evers' shutdown order this week in a 4-3 decision, which is been, radically politicized, as everything is these days, even COVID-19 related. But the decision from the majority, the holding, pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
Which is basically, hey, we have three co-equal branches of government, governor and public health director, and the legislative branch gets to exercise the power it has been constitutionally conferred. That is what is at stake here. I don't really understand the controversy exactly, other than there's a disagreement over the policy. And so the governor has taken the position that the way to avoid a disagreement with the legislature on a particular policy is to ignore the legislator and just act as the legislature.
Be a dictator. Another, dictatorship described as or disguised as a democracy. But that didn't happen in Wisconsin. Thank goodness.
This action will inevitably lead to more sickness and death. The court will have blood on their hands, and the people of Wisconsin will not forget. That was the attorney who represented Evers commenting on the decision.
Well, and then they showed, of course, TMJ went to bars in Milwaukee and showed, packed bars, even though they weren't that packed. And they interviewed a patron who said, there's more people at the Walmart than are in here right now, so I feel safer here than shopping. Mm-hmm. At least they have a choice up there. Well, for now, but doesn't the governor and the legislature, don't they have to come up with a new plan now?
Well, they don't have to do anything. The predicate to the decision was this questioning by Justice Rebecca Bradley. Isn't the very definition of tyranny for one person to order people to be imprisoned for going to work among other ordinarily lawful activities?
Boy, we need her down here.
And also in the ruling for the majority, the justice who penned the opinion just basically said, if it's a fire, you've got to act immediately. If it's a pandemic that afflicts the state for month after month, then you can act immediately under emergency powers, but then you have to seek to enlist the legislature for legislative approval. I mean, this is like a fifth grade civics class.
Right.
Why is this in controversy? It's only in controversy because you have politicians like Evers and Pritzker and others believing that they are where the law begins and ends. And thankfully, the Wisconsin Supreme Court said they're not. If only we had a co-equal branch in Illinois that would be so enlightened. For more on this, we're pleased to be joined by Will Flanders. He is the research director at the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. Will, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on.
So how are Cheeseheads reacting to the verdict?
Yeah, so I think there's a high level of satisfaction in general. Of course, you have, just like any other state, we have division, and we have some at the county level that are implementing similar ordinances to the Safer at Home order. So that's kind of where things have gone now. The Counties Association told counties, actually, you're not going to be able to keep these in place. They're going to be declared illegal as well. So some counties, like Kenosha, right across the border there, has backed off. Some counties are keeping them in place, and no doubt will be back in court again to see if these things can pass muster of the Constitution.
So are restaurants open, hair, nail salons, gyms? What's it like up there?
A lot of businesses is opened. We do have the issue that for many, unemployment benefits are actually higher than what they were making. So they're having a little trouble getting their staffs to come back in some instances. And some places are, using their own freedom, which is all we were, really wanting is give people their own discretion and keeping their business closed. There are a few of those, but we're seeing a lot of openings of all sorts of businesses, like you just mentioned. A lot of bars around has been made fun of on TV, but look, people just, want to go out. People want to get some of the activities that they haven't been able to do the past few months, and we're definitely seeing that.
It was sort of a stunning decision in the first place, based on the caseload that Wisconsin was experiencing at the end of last month for Governor Evers to arbitrarily extend the shelter-in-place order to May 26th. And, forget it, just setting aside the legislature for a second, there is this concept of consent of the governed. Mike DeWine, the governor of Ohio, has been a good example of somebody who's got some sensitivity to that. So reversing policies he was going to enact because he wasn't receiving consent of the governed, popular consent, and in a separate and distinct from legislative consent. And it seems like Evers just got out over his skis with respect to where Wisconsin residents were.
I think that's right. I think he sort of followed the national Democrats around the country and sort of implementing some of these things. If you look back during the first month, during the initial safer at home order, there wasn't a great deal of opposition. On both sides, we didn't really know where we stood. We didn't know the level of danger this virus posed, and there wasn't a lot of folks out there saying this shouldn't be in place. But a lot of us, including some of the lawyers at my own place where we were filed an amicus brief in this case, said this is unconstitutional, right? You can't just extend these things. You've exceeded your limited emergency powers here, and that's why we filed the amicus brief. That's why the legislature sued. So there was goodwill at first, but that was sort of burned away with the extension that, as you say, a lot of folks would say wasn't necessary.
Don't you think it's only a matter of time before Pritzker sued, just as similar, what you just went through in Wisconsin?
I think this is going to be the sort of the clearing call around the country that, if you have an executive who's exceeding their authority, that's doing things that are beyond the constitutional powers of the office, there is a window. There is still a constitution. The governor and the legislature still have to work together, as you guys said, as co-equal branches of government, and the legislature can't just be ignored. So I think, to the extent that you have a different situation in Illinois where the legislature is not in Republican hands, but to the extent that there is opposition and there is a willingness to disagree with the governor and come out against the policies that are being put in place, I think this could be the benchmark for change in a lot of states.
Yeah, the difference between Wisconsin and Illinois is there's no Republican Party, there's no opposition party, so that becomes a bit of a challenge.
Yeah.
I wanted to move to this survey that you did there at Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty about families' experience with K through 12 education in this time. I rope in Brendan O'Neill's piece in Spiked Online talking about working people in England. The naivete of believing that halting economic life is in any way good for working people is staggering. The lockdown most severely affects working class people who need to leave their homes to earn a living, and its global consequences will be most severely felt by the world's lowest paid workers. Well, to some extent, this is applicable here, just on different measurements, but the same dynamic. And you find that in your survey about the experience that Wisconsin families are having with K through 12 education in these times, that those on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum are getting hit the hardest.
That's right. In our survey, we did a survey of 400 Wisconsin parents 2 weeks ago. So we didn't capture the newest changes, but sort of the environment as it still is in Illinois and as it was in Wisconsin until a couple days ago. But what we found is that a lot of families are having to actually spend money on educational resources, whether it be for computers and tablets or just supplemental, materials, tutoring online. And some of those expenses are quite large. 10% of the respondents in our poll said they've had to spend more than $500. So this suggests, folks that are going out and having to buy computers. But the most concerning thing was that the lowest income respondents, those that made under $20,000 in household income a year, were the most likely to say they've had to spend money. So those with the least ability to spend are having to spend the most under this new situation that we're in K-12.
What about the people of low-income families? I mean, what's their job loss look like for those parents?
So we knew there was extensive job loss, and we've seen it, in the unemployment data. But I think we're still behind the ball in terms of capturing the extent to which people have suffered job losses because of the safer at home orders and things of that nature. We found that 40% of our sample had either had a job loss, been furloughed, or had their hours cut, and that was over 50% among the lowest income respondents. So over 50% of those making under $20,000 a year have seen some sort of cut to their job or to their employment.
And in big districts like the Milwaukee School District, there's a sizable percentage of families that are reporting their children are, through distance learning, are being taught the same material that has already been covered. I mean, there's no new learning going on.
That's right. There were a couple concerning things here. We asked how many hours are you spending on education a week, and the second most common answer, about 40% of respondents, was 1 to 10 hours. So when you compare that to how much learning goes, into a regular school day, you have 30 hours a week or more in the classroom. That's concerning. We may not expect the same amount of learning time, particularly as you mentioned, with families having to divide, their work environment at home and with their child's education. But 1 to 10 hours does call into question the extent to which kids are going to be prepared to move on to next year if their learning is that little. And we also asked, are you covering new material, old material, or some combination of both? About 17% of respondents said that they're only covering old material, and this was more prevalent in Milwaukee, as they've really sort of said in some of these districts, we're just going to review, we're not going to do anything new, and we'll go back next year. But that's going to put these kids way behind in districts where they're already behind compared to the other areas of the state.
Awful. And do parents have a choice if they want to have their kids go through the same year again, if they want to hold them back?
So that's an interesting question. We asked in the poll, what do you want to happen next year? That was a very unpopular response. Only 2% of folks that they want kids to repeat the same grade. But, maybe there should be that option out there. I think at this point it'd be left up to the individual districts to decide whether they want to offer that option to parents. But when we get back and, we can assess where kids stand and where people are, that may become a more prevalent concept.
You should maybe next survey you do ask if people believe that the teachers and administrators' salaries should be held back permanently to their previous salaries and benefit packages going forward. How about that?
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. I mean, the reality is that we see that folks are having to spend money, and we see that education is happening in the home environment. School district buildings are not open. There has to be some savings there, right? It may not be a total savings. They're still paying staff, but some of that money, why can't it go back to the parents and families? Why can't we create an education savings account, at least in the very short term, so that families have that resource that otherwise is sort of being wasted on an empty school building to use for things that would help their child keep up and continue to be educated? And we're big supporters of ESAs in general, and particularly in this instance, I think there's a good cause to advocate for that, both in Wisconsin and around the country.
He is Will Flanders, Research Director at the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. Will, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Yeah, thanks, Will. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
And it feels so good. You switch to Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
This is Owen Strand for townhall.com. Whether we remember our heroes or not tells us much about who we are as a people. On this week 80 years ago, May 10th, 1940, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of Great Britain. In the midst of the worst crisis in 1,000 years of Western history, he took the seals of office and began staging a masterclass in statesmanship. Churchill took the full force of his enemy, absorbing Hitler's attacks psychically for the British people. The man's greatest hour was the time of England's greatest trial. The weathering of the terrifying aerial blitzkrieg, vicious U-boat hunting in the Atlantic, and much more besides. Winston Churchill was no perfect man. But in the week marking the 80th anniversary of the beginning of his prime ministerial effort to save Britain and Western civilization, we remember him.